Dr. Denise Furness. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, I am so happy to be here.
I should say, welcome back to the podcast a third time. You are
Yeah.
in esteemed company. I think off the
Yes.
top of my head, Carly has obviously been on it a lot because of Mojo Mondays. Craig Harper and Grant Schofield, and you, I reckon, are the only people that've been on three.
Now, I hope what I'm about to say is right, because if not, I'll be embarrassing myself terribly. Did I see you send out an email and you had your 2023, top podcasts, and I was up there at the top?
Yes.
Yeah. Woo!
That is right. Your last fund was the most listened to of my podcast in 2023.
Yeah. And you know what? That was the start of the BioAge study. And how exciting was that?
That was very, very cool. So for those who don't remember, me and Denise, we started a biological aging study where we used all of these very funky, high tech epigenetic aging clocks, which Denise can go into a little bit more detail. And there was a whole heap of people on the study, and we are just going through the results of it now. So, do you want to give people and I know not all the data is through, but you've seen everybody's report, so we can talk about it from a non-statistical perspective.
So when we first came up with this reversing biological age study, Paul and I were going to have a 3-month intervention. But what was really exciting is that we had a group of people want to continue. So we had biological age information from the beginning before we jumped into the intervention, which was diet, lifestyle, supplements, exercise. Then we have data at the 3-month time point. And then we had about 36 people out of the almost 60 continue on with the protocol for 6 months. So I have seen all of the results from the 3 months, and majority of people had what I would say is almost phenomenal results. When
Mm.
you consider that we are doing this really through lifestyle. And as I said to you, Paul, just before we jumped on, there's people out there spending millions of dollars on plasma injections, gene editing, all this stuff to reverse their biological age. And we've done this through diet and lifestyle and a few key supplements. So majority of people did reverse their biological age, meaning, and just to step back a little bit, we have our chronological age. So that's your birthday, how old you are from when you were born. But then there is something known as biological age. So some people could be 50, but actually their biological age is 40. They're fit,
Mm.
they're healthy. But someone could be 50 and actually they're struggling. They've got a chronic illness, they're in pain. And when you go and do these tests, they might come out at, 60. So there can be quite a big difference with biological age. And what we know is that we can actually change this. As you would all know as listeners of Paul's podcast, you can improve your health at any point in time. And we use these new, really just released, very recent tests in Australia. They've been in the US and other countries for a while that have been shown to measure biological age. And for those of you who don't know much about the tests, there are these kind of algorithms. So there are different biological clocks. And what's interesting about this particular report or the test we do, we don't actually come out with one age, which can be a bit confusing, can't it,
Mm.
Paul?
Yeah, certainly
um,
can.
very, very confusing. But we are using what is in the current literature that has been developed over the last sort of 10 years, looking at ways to determine biological age. So we look at an overall biological age, an immune age, something else called the Dunedin pace. So there is pace of aging. Some people are aging at a faster rate, a slower rate. We look at telomeres, we look at risk of diabetes. So I've seen all the results from the 3 months, and aside from a few people where we really can pinpoint why they didn't get the benefit, particularly those that followed the protocol. And that was because a few people did get sick. There was a few COVID infections in there. We now know firsthand that mucks up epigenetics and biological age for a little bit longer than we thought.
Hmm.
Initially, we say to people, just hold off for 2 weeks if you've been sick or, you've had an infection or some kind of, stressful event. And 2 people actually had surgeries. And again, we thought 2 weeks would be enough, but it shows that it does, impact results. Probably no surprise, but we do understand why they didn't get the great results. And then we're going through the 6-month information as we speak.
Yeah, so just for people who may be a bit geeky and up on some of those clocks, so there's an intrinsic age, which is the Horvath clock. I think that was the original one, wasn't it, Steve Horvath? And
Yeah, Steve
then
Horvath was the first to show that he could measure biological age in any tissue because different cells, different tissues age at different rates. As you know, Paul, the
Mhm.
flubberjubbers. So for those that are going, what is she talking about? Paul and I presented at a conference in Melbourne. And despite me being the professional and the expert talking to a room full of mainly medical practitioners, when I explained to them that tissues age at different rates, I referred to my breasts as flubberjubbers because that's what my son had recently called them. And this ties into the fact that breast tissue ages at a faster rate, everyone. So women out there, we want to blame our kids for breastfeeding or whatever, but actually they age faster. But so does our brain, sadly, but the immune cells age at a slower rate. So did you nearly wet yourself at the conference,
I
Paul?
nearly pissed myself in the audience when you came out with flubber jubbers. I thought that is absolutely brilliant in a scientific conference. You just can't beat it. Um, so the interesting the rate of aging, that Dunedin pace, that's a really interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, the Dunedin, if we are really looking at this the way that you and I are, Paul, you and I, we don't actually care about a number. What we want to do is show that we are improving someone's health. And the Dunedin pace was actually designed looking at a number of biomarkers, so blood biomarkers, brain imaging, facial aging. So aside from, chronological age, which the other clocks, so the other clocks we're talking about, Stephen Horvath, who, yes, came out with probably the most robust biological aging clock. And by the way, that is actually still used in some cases in forensics to identify the age of a body, or even in the case
Ah.
of refugees. So that clock is really designed to come up with an age. But the Dunedin pace, which is looking at, faster or slower aging, wasn't designed. It wasn't an algorithm and putting things together, trying to come up with a number. It was designed looking at all of these blood markers and health outcomes like cardiovascular disease and stroke and all of the mortality, time of death, along with, as I said, the brain imaging, facial aging. So it's much more designed for health outcome rather than trying to just come up with a number. So the Dunedin pace is definitely the one up until recently where we wanted to put most of our focus. So
Mhm.
even though you're getting quite a few different markers linked to age, the reality is the Dunedin pace is the one that you probably want to put the most energy into, looking at whether it's faster or slower.
Yeah, because if you get a score above one on the Dunedin pace, it shows a really significant increased risk of death. I think more than 50% increased risk of death in the next 7 years.
Yes.
And not just of death, but of chronic disease. And I was quite happy to see. I was very nervous about this Dunedin pace aging because of my sort of former, that is a transitioning party boy lifestyle. And I originally come out at 0.99, so I was just below that, and then at the end of the 3 months, 0.905. So that was an improvement I was very happy with.
And I, of course,
You're extremely happy with yours.
yeah, extremely happy. But I think too, when we look at your 6 months, because of the improvements, I mean, of course I can't, this is hypothetically, but you're probably going to be down into the 0.8s and stuff now anyway. So but yeah, I had a significant improvement. Actually, I think the biggest decrease in the whole study, so I went from about 0.83, we just had a look at it, didn't we, before we jumped on, because I wanted to be sure, to 0.62. And so that means that every year I'm aging, every 12 months, I'm, there's 4 months of that, I'm,
Mm.
not, I've got an extra 4 months every year. And believe me, people, I need it. I'm not here saying, oh my God, I'm an angel and everything's amazing, because actually my biological age to start with did come out higher. similar to Paul. Hence, we've connected because we do like having a great time, having a drink, party people. I've lived a, very intense life where I've overtrained, probably drunk too much at certain times, didn't sleep enough, high stress job, cared for both my parents, which I think has taken its toll on me. And actually this study came off the back of after my dad passed, because I thought I was losing my health. Again, I was just stuck in my head and guilt and reliving all sorts of things and wishing I could change things. And I was I wouldn't say I was depressed, but I wasn't in a great space.
Mm.
And it wasn't serving me. And I just felt so tired, so fatigued, just trying to get through the day. And the healthy aging study has really pulled me through that, which is, yeah, great.
Very cool. And look, part of that, which is kind of what we're actually here to talk about today, a big part of the intervention was a nutritional intervention. So we had a chat and thought it might be really useful to just talk about different diets that are out there. Because there are the diet wars that I have mentioned a few times, right? There's the extremes, right? You have the vegan on one end and the carnivore on the other. And then when you
Yeah.
come in a little bit to the middle, you got vegetarian, and then on the other end, you got paleo. Then you got the high fat, low carb, low fat, high carb, which is on a kind of a different axis as well. So I thought it would be good just to have a bit of a chat about those different diets. And from your perspective, and I'm happy to chip in, what are the pros and cons of those different types of eating, and really what do people need to think about when it comes to their diet?
Yeah, and I want to make it clear that I think a big component of the healthy aging study and why we got such great results, or for anyone, is wanting to feel good and energetic and clear skin or recover from a chronic illness, nutrition is absolutely essential. When it comes to these diets, there are extremes, as you said, when you think about vegan and carnivore, just absolute opposite extremes. If we're thinking about healthy aging, though, some of you might be aware that a lot of those blue zone diets tend to actually, they're the Mediterranean style. So a Mediterranean diet tends to be predominantly plant-based. They do eat meat, but a lower intake of meat. And then depending on the region, sometimes more oily fish, but they get a lot of their protein from legumes. So mixing whole grains and legumes, beans and things like that. So they're getting their complete protein. So that is associated with a lot of the longevity studies. But the reality is, I think where Paul and I connect too, is that if we are thinking about optimal health, you do want to be getting in that protein so that you don't get what's known as sarcopenia.
Yeah, and a really interesting one that some people may have seen on Netflix. There's that diet, the Netflix series "You Are What You Eat," and it's about the twin study that's been run by Stanford University, and they turned it into a TV program. I did a commentary on the twin study. So half of the twins, beautifully designed study, half of the twins on an omnivore diet, and the other half went on to a vegan diet. And they looked at different health markers. Now, there were a number of methodological issues with it. Not least that it was driven by a guy called Walter Willett, who is a known vegan advocate and sponsored by vegan people. So there's been a definitive slant on it, which is probably not the best science. However, what they did show is that, and look, this has been shown reasonably consistently, is that in terms of some of the cardiovascular outcomes, lower LDL on the vegan diet. And some people would argue about the relevance with just LDL, but they also lost more weight, right? And it turns out they were eating about 200 calories a day less, which was hidden in the supplementary materials, right? But importantly, and nobody's talked about this, certainly not in all the promotion that it's getting, they lost muscle. Right.
Yes.
Not only
Yes.
did they lose weight, but a significant amount of that weight was muscle. So these, like any dietary study, is really hard to pull really good data out of, because Number one, they tend to be very short term.
I
So
was just about to say that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but while I'm sitting here listening to this too, I think there's no doubt that a higher vegetable intake, and we can get to that, and that's what we obviously had in our study and what I promote is, lots of
yeah,
veggies. It's so many things. But if we are talking about long term, what you and I are talking about, Paul, we're talking about lifelong health. My mum had Alzheimer's, my dad struggled at the end. I want to be fit and strong and independent. You want that muscle. You still,
mhm,
so if you are eating these diets, yes, maybe you'll live a bit longer, but depending on the lifestyle you want to lead, if you want to be strong and fit, you actually need to be getting that protein, because otherwise you're going to be taking it from your muscles or not able to build muscle. And we know that most people, when you look at all the studies, as you know too, Paul, once we hit a certain age, we just break down muscle mass, but we don't have to. If you're doing
yeah, that's
strength
right.
training and if you're eating enough protein. So even though they say that's what happens, we can actually change that through diet and exercise. And I think some of these short-term studies, you get lots of benefits because, from a lipid perspective, Mediterranean, vegetarian, vegan are the best for our lipids generally, more
Hmm.
plant-based,
Yeah.
no doubt about that, compared to paleo. But mind you, there's so many benefits if paleo around metabolic health too, in a sense. But yeah, definitely good for the lipids. But if you're thinking about overall health and not just a biomarker, my thing would be, looking at these studies, look at these people in 5 years, 10 years, and look at physical function as well.
Correct. And look, I think to play into it as well, there's a lot of talk about the blue zones and a big push from the vegetarian and vegan community around, well, hey, look at the blue zones, and in those blue zones, they tend to be plant-based. Um, and we need to define plant-based, right? Because it kind of gets lumped in with vegan, whereas vegan and vegetarian, they are plant diets,
Yes.
not necessarily plant based. So I would eat a plant based diet in that
Yes.
most of the volume that I eat would be fruit and vegetables and legumes and all of that. But I do eat a significant amount of meat and fish. So it depends whether you're talking about volume, calories, those sorts of things. I think the other factor that a lot of people don't talk about with the blue zones is that there's a whole heap of other stuff that goes into it. Number one, they have very, very, very strong communities, right? They tend to eat in communities. They live an outdoor active lifestyle as well. So they're very, very active.
They
And
are
they
growing those vegetables. Talk about active lifestyle. They're there
correct.
digging, they're there digging the hole, and they're getting fresh food. They're making the pasta themselves. They're making the minestrone soup with their legumes and veggies. They're not buying it from the supermarket in a tin or in a packet.
Correct. And it for me, it's the entire lifestyle that we should be drawing inferences from, not just to. So for the listeners, to really tease apart the nutritional component, what you would have to have is a bunch of people who just have the nutrition that these guys would have and don't have the physical activity, don't have the community aspect to it. And then you would have other groups who would have the nutrition and the physical activity, but not the community. And then
Mm.
you would have, you know what I mean? You need to run lots of arms of the study to then be able to go in and identify, okay, what is it that's actually coming from nutrition?
Mm.
So obviously we can get better information when we look at randomized control trials, and particularly with a crossover design,
Mm.
which you can talk people through if you like. But again, the problem with those is they tend to be very short term, don't they?
Mm. And that is the issue with human studies in general, particularly when we come to something like longevity or healthy aging. It's the continuation to look at that long-term data and not just a shift. Because in all honesty, any diet could give you a bit of a benefit. Like if someone comes to you and says, I've just gone carnivore or paleo or vegan or whatever it may be, and I'm feeling great, often that's because they've actually had a big shift,
Yeah.
which can be good for the microbiome, but they've also probably taken out sugar, processed foods, and maybe it's not even just that diet as such, it's they're now eating more real food. And that's really what I know that's what you think, Paul, and that's how we've come together and worked together, is we're talking about just eating real food and getting rid of as many of those processed and packaged foods as possible. We don't do perfect. We all want to live and have fun, but if you're eating real food most of the time, you know where it comes from. That I think is the big, especially in the short term, when people say I feel amazing or I've lost some weight, they're all dropping calories because these processed foods are high in often, poor quality fats or the omega-6s. So just thinking about inflammation, which causes, sometimes joint pain or different pains, or, brain fog or struggling to lose weight, fluid retention, etc. Inflammation is often an underlying issue in lots of people. When you start eating more of these whole foods, you're going to be getting less of the omega-6s, and that brings back your balance of omega-3 and omega-6s. And all of a sudden, you're having a lower inflammatory kind of diet as well. So I think sometimes it's like, do we even need to go to extremes? Maybe we're probably almost jumping to the end of what the podcast would be here too, in what that you and I prescribe is just eat as much real good food as often as possible, and then think about what are your goals. Is it to recover from an autoimmune disease like I have, putting on muscle like probably lots of your clients, Paul, or what is that goal? And then you tweak to what you need.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to identify what happens when you shift both ways, right? So when people eat a traditional Australian, American, UK diet, they're eating a lot of these ultra processed foods. And I did a cracking podcast last week, which I'll refer people if they haven't, about the fructose survival hypothesis from Richard Johnson, whose team has shown that when you eat a lot of fructose, and it's not from eating a couple of pieces of fruit a day, it's from all the fructose in the ultra processed food. And remember that table sugar is half fructose, half glucose.
Correct.
It actually flips a survival switch, which lowers the ATP in the mitochondria, which then triggers you to eat more.
Yeah, because you're tired. You don't have energy. So what do you want? You want carbohydrates for energy. You want glucose. Yes.
Correct. And so he's showing that you eat more, that it triggers inflammation, that it reduces leptin, and something that blew me away, that the human body and the human brain both create fructose from high carbohydrate diets. Right. So you could, neither did I, and I got blown away. It's the polyol pathway. And it basically, if you eat too much carbs, the polyol pathway will become activated. That will create fructose from glucose, the breakdown of the carbohydrates, and lower the ATP in the cell and create a temporary low energy crisis, which then makes you eat more and move less. And it can have pretty horrendous effects all throughout the body and the brain. So when you're eating those ultra processed food diets, you're going to be getting a shitload of fructose and a shitload of highly processed carbohydrates, right? But
poor quality fats, oxidized omega-6s, and
poor quality fats, and there's a crowding out of all the healthy foods. So maybe we'll talk about the benefits of real foods and talk about eating, proper grass-fed meat versus sausages and sausage rolls and crappy stuff, and vegetables and fruit, and how they impact upon our biology.
So when you're just talking about the grass-fed meat, so straight away these will have a higher content of, as I said, the omega-3s. But just getting back to the vegetables or just whole foods in general, I'm a geneticist, so I was thinking about the interaction, and that was my PhD, nutrigenomics, the interaction between macronutrients, or particularly micronutrients, and our DNA, our genes. So when we eat food, we don't just get calories. And I want to emphasize that to the listeners too, or sort of thinking, oh, it's the beginning of the year, I'm going to drop some calories. It's not just about calories with our food. We get these vitamins and minerals, but we also get, phytonutrients, and we're learning so much more. This is relatively new, but these phytonutrients and bioactive compounds literally talk to our DNA. So getting back to our biological aging study, Paul, the food
Mm.
that we have in there, all of we had nuts and seeds and vegetables, and talk to people about possibly getting wild caught fish and grass-fed meats and things like that, and if possible organic. If not organic, go and have a chat to your local fruiter and grocer and just see what it might have been sprayed with. Sometimes things aren't organic, but they might have been, for example, I live in Doonan, Noosa hinterland. There's a lot of people growing fruits and vegetables. They're not always labeled organically, but have a chat to them if you're getting some local stuff, and they'll spend 10 minutes telling you how they just use garlic spray and how they look after the soil and things like that. So asking some questions to your butcher, to your fruiterer, the grocery guy, and understanding where your food comes from, because these real foods, as I said, give you the building blocks, the amino acids, the vitamins, the macronutrients, but there are these other active compounds that go in and change epigenetic patterns. These are things, epigenetics, it's like this layer of information that sits on top of your DNA that affects what genes are being turned off and on. So just to give an example, most of you listening probably know that blueberries are thought of as antioxidants. Why are they antioxidants? They get in and they turn on certain antioxidant genes, really powerful genes that act as enzymes that clear up all these waste products that could actually damage your cells, give you inflammation, make you feel awful. So there are these other components of whole foods, real foods, that actually interact with our DNA and honestly produce that true cellular health. There's my little spiel there.
Yeah. And look, I think therein lies the benefits of eating a vegan or a vegetarian diet, is that you are getting a bucket load of these nutrients, right? These phytonutrients, of which we know there are 10 to 15,000 of them, right? And a whole heap of them we don't even know what they do, right? So I think that's the benefit of eating lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and pulses and legumes and those sorts of things. If you are eating those, because so you can be on a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet and be eating a lot of soy burgers and impossible meat, and that stuff is just shit, right? That is way worse for you than eating processed meat, I think, because of the amount of chemicals that are in it and all sorts of nasties that go into those sorts of things. So I think that they are the benefits of eating that. If you're eating a pretty clean vegan vegetarian diet, you're going to give your body shit heaps of nutrients. I think the downside for me is that we know that these diets tend to be very low in omega-3 fatty acids. And this is where I put my neuroscientist hat on, is that is the most critical nutrient for the brain, closely followed by vitamin B12, zinc and iron, and a number of other different things that tend to be, and iodine as well. And we know what happens if you get low iodine, like it just retards brain development. This is why I'm not
hypothyroid. Yeah.
And so, some people say that I'm anti-vegan. I'm not. I'm very, very cautionary about particularly having children on a vegan or vegetarian diet, because they have such a need for these nutrients, because the brain and nervous system is still developing into the 20s, right?
I think it's a contraindication, though, even medically. If you look at diets, I do believe that it is at ACNM, we do talk about diets, and educating medical doctors about nutrition, because they don't learn it. And it comes up as a contraindication, like for development for children. So we're not saying that adults can't do it, but you need to be a vegan that actually is mixing together to get the complete protein, those whole grains and those pulses and legumes. Otherwise you won't. Plus you do need to eat lots of these good foods so that you don't have the deficiencies, because the limitation, yes, there's tons of benefits eating these whole foods, as you said, if you're eating them and not eating packets of chips. I mean, I've had vegans come to me, we do dietary assessments, and they're eating packets of chips and, rice crackers and, the vegan burger. They're not even having as many vegetables as you would assume. You often think, well, you're vegan, you're eating tons of veggies. Sometimes they're not.
Yeah.
But the limitation is, in all honesty, with all diets where you're cutting out major food groups, is deficiencies. And long term, not only a macronutrient deficiency of protein, but like you said, key micronutrients, B12, that only comes from animal products.
Yeah.
Now, we can make a little bit with some of the bacteria in our gut. If you've got a healthy microbiome, you will make some vitamin B12, but that's coming from the bacteria. Otherwise, it's only animal products. And iron, yes, you can get it from spinach and other vegetables, but again, you need to be eating lots
And
of all those
it's
foods.
a really poor source. Non-heme iron is it's a pretty poor conversion rate in the body. You need to be eating a bucket load, and you need to know that that spinach has been grown in nutrient-dense soil, right?
Yes,
That's
to
one of
get
the
the
other things.
iron, we need to get those minerals from the soil, and our soils are becoming more and more deficient.
Yeah. So look, they would be some of the benefits and some of the risks around a vegan and a vegetarian diet. And obviously the vegan diet, there's slightly more risk of nutrient deficiencies than the vegetarian diet. And I always say to people, like, if you're going to be on that diet, that's fine, but make sure you supplement. I think it's pretty hard unless you're growing a lot of your own food or you know where it's coming from and you're very, very meticulous about what you're eating on a daily basis. I think it would be very hard not to be nutrient deficient. And the research is coming out showing that there are significant nutrient deficiencies when people aren't supplementing regularly. So that's just something to be aware of. Now I thought, let's maybe whack way over to the other extreme and talk about the carnivore diet, right? Which, for those who don't know, is where you just eat meat. Now, there are versions of the carnivore diet. There's the extreme carnivore diet where all you eat is meat. And then there's ones where you can eat meat and products from meat, right? So you can eat eggs and dairy and those sorts of things. So there's less extreme versions of it. What's your take before I jump in on the carnivore diet?
Well, if we just compare to what we were saying from a mineral perspective, like iron, obviously the heme iron, which comes from animal products and meat, is more bioavailable, meaning we absorb it better. So you're likely, particularly having a lot of red meat, to get, the iron. But the reality is, again, like vegan, you're dropping major food groups. And when we talk about those phytonutrients, bioactive compounds that turn on detoxification enzymes, antioxidants, you're not going to be getting those. And often there is a low fiber intake. And we cannot deny the last probably 20 years of research. Actually, we have tons of research around fiber. The things that we've got good research, as in for long-term research, is fiber and probably the omega-3s, like you said. You're not going to be getting the fiber, and that's what feeds the microbiome, all those microbes and gut bugs. And what we are learning, and I think I'm pretty, the research seems to be very robust, in meaning that it's clear that the more diverse and the more abundant, so lots of different species of bugs and microbes, and the more microbes you have, basically the better your immune system, the better your overall health. And if you're not getting all those plant foods, that restricts the fiber, the bioactives that are going to be feeding all those gut bugs, so potentially affecting the microbiome. And again, we don't have a lot of long-term studies to say, is this really good long-term? Now, I know some people, like with vegan, that have claimed it's been the best thing ever, but what is that going to be like in 5 years or 10 years?
Yeah, look, that was my big question mark. And I was initially very dismissive and thinking people who are on a carnivore diet are completely bonkers. And then I met somebody who'd been on one for 8 years and he's in fantastic health and showed me or talked about all his bloods and stuff. And I just said to him, like, yeah, let's just see what your microbiome. So he's getting that tested. But then I read up a little bit on it, right? And I was actually surprised that if you're eating grass-fed meat, the density of micronutrients in that is a lot more than we used to think. Because if you think about it, those animals are like factories that process the grasses with all of that stuff in the grasses, and it ends up in the meat. So some of these people do a lot better than you think of. I think where that can be really useful, and I've actually advised a friend of mine to try it for a month just because he has rheumatoid arthritis, right? So I think if someone has an autoimmune condition, any type of elimination diet can be the way to go, because often there are triggers in the diet. As you know, a lot of our listeners won't know, 80% of your immune system resides in the gut, and that interface between the gut, essentially your digestive system is a tract that is outside of your body. So that's how pathogens get in, and particularly in your colon. That's why we have so much immune cells. And then if people have gut dysbiosis, that leaky gut syndrome, it can trigger these autoimmune conditions. And there's lots, if you go on forums, and there's lots of people who've gone on a carnivore diet, similar to a vegan diet as well, who went, hey, I went on this diet for 3 weeks and my autoimmune condition just disappeared. Right. So I think there is the potential benefit. The risk is there's no long-term studies. There's one study that I found where they followed up a number of people who've been on it for years. It was just recently published. It's a famous guy. I can't remember his name, but they were actually all in the vast majority of them were in pretty good health, and they've been on it for 3 to 5 years. And some reports are that actually some components of the gut microbiome that we thought were really going to struggle, such as short chain fatty acids. Well, actually, when you think about it, butyrate, butter is full of butyrate, right? And triggers the release of butyrate in the cells. My concern is, what does that gut microbiome look like long term?
Yeah. And just getting back to the type of foods, like you said, these grass-fed meats, but also the butter, getting good quality grass-fed butter from, cows, animals that haven't been given growth hormones and antibiotics and things like that, getting good quality foods in. Because speaking about the bioactive compounds in vegetables, fruits and veggies and things like that, there's actually bioactive compounds in our fats as well, things that activate things like PPAR gamma, so certain genes that are activated by healthy real fat. So we've evolved to eat certain foods, and we have evolved in conjunction with this world around us. But in the last 50 to 100 years, also 50 years, the food has changed so much, and it's not talking to our DNA the way it should. So I think if you're eating real foods, and also just checking in with yourself to say, well, how am I responding? Because talking about the carnivore diet, I'm thinking of two people, as you said, that one who recovered from cancer. He's now been on it for years and claimed to be thriving. Initially, I think there were some changes in bowels, but now he's totally regular and does lots of blood testing. But another patient of mine who's no longer carnivore, she was actually in our study pool. She's been working with me for a while. She's actually very, very healthy. Went the other way in that she was probably having predominantly plant-based foods, lots and lots of smoothies in the morning, tons of veggies, but started having a few little symptoms like rashes, like a few little skin things. And long story short, went carnivore temporarily and cleared up all of that. And what we think is that maybe there's a bit of a sensitivity in this particular person around oxalates. When she has a lot of spinach, even though a lot of these plant foods are very good, they do have components in it that can be a little bit reactive, particularly if you're having tons of raw stuff. The amount of raw veggies this woman was having in the morning, thinking she was healthy, but going carnivore for a short amount of time, just that big shift, which, no doubt changed the microbiome. She wasn't able to stay on that long term, even though she felt better. It just wasn't something sustainable. And that's another thing for all the listeners to think about. Yes, we might be sitting here saying this diet's good, this one. It's like, what works for you? How much time have you got to prepare? Like, what do you still want to enjoy food? It's a pleasure. You don't want to feel restricted all the time, because that can start to have some psychological things if you become obsessed with diet and things like that. So we introduced, some vegetables and things like that slowly. She definitely does not eat as many, particularly raw vegetables, but is having a higher meat diet than what she was initially, which is actually suits perfectly to the healthy aging stuff, because she is someone who's in her 60s now, actually the daughter of the lady who was the oldest person in our study pool. So we had the 82-year-old. So both of them have been with me probably my longest. So when I moved from research and science into clinical practice, have been with me for about 10 years. And her mum, for all the listeners, is 82. She was the oldest person in our study. The first time she had her biological age tested, she came out at 72, so already 10 years younger. I thought, I'm not sure if we'll see a difference. The reality is, you know, her diet was already good. She jogs every single day. She's 82, but she lives, there's 3 generations in one household. You know, you talked about community before, Paul.
Mm.
So she cooks for everyone, very independent. But she dropped her biological age by another 6, almost 7 years in our study, which is just phenomenal. It showed there was improvement from a few tweaks. But I think, you know, overall, what you want to do is get as much nutrition as possible.
Yeah.
You know, this is where I sit. Of course, think about your beliefs, think about what suits you, but as much nutrition as possible from as many real foods, whole foods, and then you're giving your body what it needs. And when you're getting all of the nutrients you need, you feel good, you've got energy, you can then afford every now and again, because I think everyone wants to live and enjoy food, that on the odd occasion, you do have a fun night out, or it's a birthday, or it's this or that. You know, if someone wants to eat clean, if I can use the word clean all the time, good on you. But I just love life and food so much that I'm not always going to be perfect. But if you're doing the right thing most of the time and you're not deficient, your body can thrive and you can even recover, as you've mentioned, Paul, and I've done firsthand, and so many patients of mine over the years now. You can turn autoimmune and chronic disease around through nutrition and changing your lifestyle.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And then if we if we talk about another one, the paleo diet, which is almost the best of both worlds with a few little riders, right? So the paleo diet, for those who don't know it, tends to eat more the traditional human diet, although there's a lot of question marks about, you know, what was the traditional human diet. In fact, we now know there were lots of different traditional human diets depending on where you lived and what time of the year.
And what was available, in your environment, exactly.
But generally, they talk about pre-agricultural, right? So they don't eat a lot of grains. And they say the whole grain thing has been overhyped. And then people would come back and say, well, if you're not eating a lot of whole grains, you're going to be missing out on some fibers. And they're saying, well, I can get my fiber from vegetables and fruit, and I can get it from things like yams and potatoes. And actually, when you look at some of the research studies I've looked at, that the gut microbiome for people who eat a paleo diet is very, very healthy. And I think if you were going to pick one of those label diets, I would lean towards that one if, and with that rider, if you're eating real foods, right? If you're eating lots of fruit and vegetables, you're eating sweet potatoes and other tubers, you're eating grass-fed meat, you're eating plenty of fish, and you're not eating a lot of these processed paleo bars and stuff like that, right? It basically comes down to eat real food, which is why I like to talk about the low HI or low human interference. But if you were to ask me, if I was to put my money on what would be the best diet, let's forget about the ethics and the environmental, right? Because when you bring that argument in, the vegan,
it gets there's lots of elements.
Yeah. And they've got very strong arguments with the rider of, well, actually, when you look at regenerative farming, that's really good. And there are a lot of negatives with this monocropping and stuff like that, right? But if we put that to the side, if you were to ask me, we're going to have 4 groups of people, right? And we're going to follow them for their entire lives. Right? You're going to have a group that's eating a vegan diet, one that's eating a vegetarian diet, one that's eating a carnivore diet, and one that's eating a paleo diet. And they're all eating healthy versions of those diets with low ultra processed foods. I would be very confident on staking quite a lot of money on the paleo guys. I'm not sure what your opinion is. We'll throw it over to you. What would you think? Which horse would you back?
So I guess it's hard to not talk about what I think and what I eat. And again, I want to eat what I think is good for me. And I probably have similar to a paleo diet in the sense of, and what's becoming a recent cool term, if people have heard about it, is a high protein Mediterranean diet. That's just another way. People, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, paleo was cool. Now no one's talking about it. Now it's a high protein Mediterranean diet. You look at it and you're like, that's really what we would class as a paleo diet. There is actually a study, and I can send it to you. It's a few years old now, where they have actually compared the DASH diet, which was designed to help bring down high blood pressure, hypertension. So a little bit more plant-based. It has got animal foods, but low sodium. It compared the DASH, a paleo diet, plant-based diet, high fat, low carb, a bit like a ketogenic diet. Anyway, all these different diets. And what it showed is that the paleo diet, it didn't perform consistently as being the best, but so just to let you know what we're actually comparing it to, by the way, all of these diets were compared to inflammatory markers, including CRP, C-reactive protein. That's something that increases in your blood if there's inflammation. Interleukin-6, another inflammatory marker. It then tested glycemic control, so blood glucose, insulin, and then it did all the lipids, so including triglycerides, cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and then apolipoproteins. And what it showed was that the paleo diet, interestingly, you would think it was plant-based because most studies show that the vegetarian vegan is the best for lipids, but it came out really good for the lipids and good for a few others, but not consistent. It was actually, no surprise, the ketogenic style, high fat, low carb, was the best for lipids. I think paleo, again, was the best for inflammation. But I can share that study with you. But the point to bring from that is that no diet, there was a whole heap of diets, not one of them performed the highest consistently across all the levels. There were differences.
And this is where my interest is in hard outcomes. So all of these things that we measure in dietary studies are proxies, right? So they are markers of some chronic disease or other, right? So inflammatory markers, lipids around heart disease, and a lot of the focus is on LDL. But then when you look at hard outcomes, 50% of people who die with heart attacks have normal levels of LDL, right? So this is where some of those markers, they presume that there's going to be a better outcome. Whereas I think the only way that you're going to answer that question is you're going to need to follow up people till they die and find, as they're aging, as they're getting into their 50s and their 60s, who's getting what chronic diseases, who's getting more diabetes, who's getting more obesity, who's getting more cardiovascular disease, who's getting more dementia, and then what does the impact have on all-cause mortality, right? So one diet, so for instance, you mentioned it there, we hadn't mentioned this, the kind of Atkins and the newer variations of the Atkins diet, the high-fat, low-carbs. If you're diabetic, absolutely, this is the best diet to go on, and particularly in the short to moderate term, right? So
and we can see now, even at university, they are starting to, talk about that as being a possible way, dietary intervention for type 2 diabetes. So it's getting there. It's actually getting there.
They're only 20 years late, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I'm saying it's even getting out to the mainstream. That just shows how big an impact it has, because it doesn't get to the mainstream, right? It takes 20 years.
What we know, it does take nearly 20 years to get from good quality studies all the way through the teaching things out into the professional world, right? So they often massively lagging, or certainly the stuff that's taught at university level. But if you're worried about cognitive decline, and particularly if you're high blood sugar, if you've got high blood sugar, diabetes, then at high fat, low carb, absolutely the way to go. So I think, as we talk about these things, it's really about horses for courses, right? And what is your current state of health? And what are your goals, right? So we could talk about fasting. That opens a whole nother can of worms. But I'll be saying to people, hey, if you're metabolically challenged, intermittent fasting is the way to go. If you're like me or you, I've actually stopped doing intermittent fasting because I was losing muscle, and I do not want to lose muscle. I'm metabolically very healthy. I just do not want to lose any more muscle because I want quality of life, not just longevity, right? So I think the answer is, what's the best diet? Has to start with, it depends. It depends on where you are right now and what your goals are in the short term and the long term. And the answer of what's the best diet might be different depending on how long we're looking into the future.
And what I would love to say to all the listeners is, what might be the right diet for you today, right now, while you're listening to this podcast, might not be the right diet for you in 6 months or 5 years. Because if you are recovering from type 2 diabetes, an autoimmune condition, you may need to go to extremes. So when I was recovering from my autoimmune, I cut gluten, cut dairy, cut coffee, cut alcohol, so there could be a short-term diet where you really have to hone in to make some big changes metabolically, biochemically, turning on all those genes that are going to help you heal. But then as time goes on, when you're back in homeostasis, so balance, no longer having these symptoms, your diagnosis is gone, you're off your medication, whatever it may be, then you get to a bit more of a sustainable diet that is easier to, because it's very difficult to be on these extreme diets long term. That can be a stress in itself. So when you're focused and all your energy is there, great. But life will pull you in different directions. You'll have a child to look after, or a parent, or, whatever it may be. So you want to have a more sustained diet that doesn't require so much sort of energy and effort that still works for you. And so your diet, the best diet for you right now is the best diet for you right now.
Yes.
And that might change,
Yeah. 100%. Absolutely. And look, I think if people are just looking to, if they're kind of going okay, or they're like, geez, I'm put on a bit of weight, what would the advice be there? I think the big thing is, forget about carnivore, vegan, paleo, those sorts of things. Just reduce the amount of ultra processed food you eat, and just go by the maxim. If it's been alive recently and minimally interfered with by humans, eat it. And if you're looking at it and you cannot see that it's been alive, then it's in the very occasional bucket. Because what that will do is make sure you're eating lots of nutrient dense foods, right? You're eating lots of fresh fruit and vegetables. If you're eating grains, you're eating the real grains, like oats, the barley, that sort of stuff. You're eating sweet potatoes, those sorts of things, but you're also eating grass-fed meat rather than sausages, and you're eating fish, ideally wild rather than farmed, and lots of nuts and seeds, and just minimizing all that other stuff. Like, if the average person was to do that for 8 weeks, they would see a massive impact on their health and well-being, and not just physically, but mentally too, cognitively as well.
Well, we have seen in 3 months, people reverse their biological age, but even less than 8 weeks, in 4 weeks. So just talking about, if someone to lose weight, not that I've got a whole food challenge coming up, as you know, that's not focused on weight loss. But to be honest, most of the people that come to my challenge want to lose weight. But my drive is about improving health. But even in 4 weeks, so what we do the first thing we do is cut sugar. And then we trial going off gluten and dairy for 2 weeks. And then you bring it back in and see how you feel. Because not everyone has to be so restrictive. But if you are having pain, fatigue, afternoon slumps, brain fog, sometimes removing some of these foods can be a game changer. So then you sort of continue with it for a bit longer. But we see in 4 weeks, so we've run this 3 times now. We didn't do it last year because we're doing the BioAge study. But 2021, 2022, we ran it. And we had 100% of people say they had more energy at the end of just 4 weeks. Most people, I think about 70% lost a few kilos. Not everyone loses weight because some people are already, lean, or as we know from the BioAge study, epigenetically, you can be in a state where it's really hard to lose weight if you've just lost some or you're going through a lot of stress. But, people's skin being better, just, even stress. We have, most people saying their stress levels, just when you start eating better, you do feel better. So, in 4 weeks, you can start to see some changes when you just get rid of some of the possibly inflammatory foods, the sugar, the processed stuff, and then start actively putting these good foods in.
So that actually brings us rather nicely to the end. And so when are you starting that 4-week challenge? Pretty soon, isn't it?
Yeah, so it actually starts on the 29th of Jan, so very soon. If people sign up, though, they get access straight away to sort of some of the information. And yeah, maybe I can give you some links and you can add them in. And for any of Paul's listeners, we are going to offer a 20% discount if you're someone that thinks, that was all great. And I do need a bit more support. You know, I want to have 4 weeks of group coaching with me. There's tons of resources. We've got a naturopath, the one that you know, Paul
Yep.
Dye, who looks after the Facebook group. So yeah, it's a really affordable way to get lots of information around nutrition if you are wanting to do that.
And sort your shit right out. So
Yeah.
if you're into that, don't go on Facebook and go to all these bullshit programs touted by friggin' Instagram. What do they call them?
Influencers.
Influencers.
Yeah.
Influencers. Go to somebody who is a hardcore PhD nutrition, lifestyle, genetics researcher in Dr. Denise Furness and get a proven program.
Yes, yes. So I would love to see you all. And if not, I hope that what Paul and I have talked about really helps you just get rid of some of the confusion around diet, because I have to say it's one thing I'm asked all the time. What is the best diet?
Yeah, absolutely. Denise, awesome to have you on again. And no doubt we will see you again when we get the full results for the BioAid study and we'll discuss that.
Yes, and everyone listen, because I like it when Paul sends emails saying that these are the top performing podcasts.
That's the one. Excellent.
Bye, everyone.
Great stuff. Thank you.